So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining me today. We are looking at our 7th lesson within the series of 18 that cover all of the development skills needed to work with Sage CRM. We are going to put this course, this session rather, into the context of the 18 that make up the program. So we're looking at workflow now. And this is the first of 2 lessons within this set of 18 that look specifically at workflow. Although we touch on other aspects of working with the product later on. So we'll be, all these rules intersect as we talk about how we implement Sage CRM within an organization, within the context of all of its different forms of rules. But this is to do with the way in which we do things. So we're concentrating in this lesson very much on the idea of the process rules that are required. Now, as we can see here, these are some of the topics that we'll be looking at: the idea of the control of process and data tasks within Sage CRM. We'll see that Sage CRM offers you a graphical representation of the workflow process, trying to represent the journey that data takes traveling without moving. And we'll also look at the way in which we can define logical as well as arbitrary steps and states throughout the workflow's journey. I say logical and arbitrary. Well, there are some transitions which we can talk about which are logical because they flow from the nature of the data, but then there are some which are arbitrary, which are the decisions that a business takes in order to define the stepping stones in a journey, and they are simply down to choices that we make and the way in which the processes within an organization are arranged. We'll look at the idea of rules, and there are 2 basic categories of rules within workflow: rules which are driven, or behavior that is driven by a user's choice. So these are interactions that can be modified by some conditional behavior that we'll see in a moment. The idea of some scripting to control when user-driven rules are available, so actions can be controlled, the availability of actions can be controlled by code. And then there is another set of behavior which is simply driven by the passage of time. So either a user does something and moves the data through a workflow, or time does something, is another actor within the business as things have to be done to a timetable, and the passage of time acts as a mechanism to force things to have been done by a certain date and time. We're not going to be looking at the time-based rules today. We'll do that next week. But all the time, we have to think about our processes aren't just about humans. They are about the inevitable tick of the clock as well. We'll see how workflow can be used as well to implement other business rules, and actually how we can start to break the boundaries of what the system says we can do on the front of it. So what we'll look at is actually the way in which we can invoke external behavior, as well as behavior that is triggered through the table level script. So we'll look at the way in which workflow rules can call ASP pages and even .NET extensions, and how the change of data can cause table level scripts and to trigger and cascade changes throughout the system as well. Okay. So looking at our first slide, really, of the materials that we're seeing here, we can see that workflow typically is designed and evolved as an organization tries to think through a process. Now, the thinking through of the process typically will start for many organizations as they're trying to replicate an existing paper-based system. So someone will pass a document for others to authorize in order for something to do, or you will be keeping track of an email conversation. But here in Sage CRM, we're trying to logically define the steps that take place. Those steps themselves, as I said, can be logical because that's to do with the nature of when something like an invoice is received. So we have a moment in time when something, a definite state, has changed in the nature of the database, but it could equally be something that is arbitrary to an organization. So sending a quote is something that has to be done if you're sending a quote, but reviewing a quote and who reviews a quote is arbitrary to an individual's into an individual business. So there are some things which are nature to the procedures that are being followed. These are, if you think back to the first lessons that we were doing right at the beginning of this, I was talking about things called policy rules. So workflow is about implementing policy within a process in order to affect data change. I've got a Visio diagram here in front of us where we can see the different steps trying to show an object being processed. This happens to be an opportunity flowing through from an early stage where it's just been converted from a lead, starting to be investigated to qualify that lead, to being marked as qualified, then going on into subsequent points within its journey. Now that journey is divided in Sage CRM into a number of different components. The first components are called the stages, or the states rather. They're called the states. So the states are these stepping stones across the process. The stepping stones mark the points in which there is a pause, and we record the fact that a state in the workflow has changed. So we captured one set of transitions, if you like. Now, the things that govern from state to state to state, and in this case, in the diagram, the state is the lead, investigating, qualified, quoted. The things that govern that are called the rules, and the rules are how we move across. Now, the rules, you can start to see, will allow for both splitting of paths, so you can take different routes through a process, and it allows for looping within a process as well. So you can see, if you look down in the diagram, you've got where I've got quoted and going on into negotiating to negotiating, and then re-quoting, sending back to quote again, indicating another quotation has to be sent out. So we can use our workflow engine to allow us to describe any number of types of flow through an organization's processes. So it has this idea of looping back, splitting apart, conditional behavior, and as well as being able to take actions at any point through the behavior of that process. Now, inside Sage CRM, there is a graphical simplification that takes place. What we end up with is something like a decision tree. It's a flow chart, or very like an organization chart, which is trying to capture these states as we move from one point to another, and the transitions or the rules that govern the movement from state to state through a process. And we can allow, as you can see, the idea that you can get to any state in more than one way. So you can see that lost and sold appear in multiple locations on this particular simple opportunity workflow, as well as allowing for looping. But because of the limitations of the design, you don't see the loop, you just see the idea that the state is repeated, and that indicates that if you arrive at a state, you're basically back at that point. So if I mark here where we end up, say, quoted at this point, well, it's actually back here at this point, and so we would have negotiating, lost and sold, even if we ended it back quoted. So there is a graphical compromise inside Sage CRM, which means that our diagramming to represent this allows for all of this behavior, but there is this sense that it looks like a decision tree, but if we end up in any particular point that is a workflow state, then we know that all of the behavior, all of the transitions beyond that state are available wherever you've ended up. Now, this is the idea of the graphical workflow that we can evolve inside Sage CRM. Now, it's at this point, I'm going to have to say that the easiest way to start to understand workflow is to use it by looking at the existing workflows within Sage CRM. We'll see in a moment there are a number of different default workflows provided inside the vanilla install. So if you install Sage CRM, you will find that there's default workflows that cover the marketing entities, sales, leads, so opportunities, leads, and customer care. And in fact, there are two opportunity workflows straight out of the box, and you can look at these and understand how they can work together and how you can see the flow of the behavior and the states inside there. Now, our graphical workflow, as I said, is a decision tree like diagram. It supports all of the features that you would expect within a process model, and you end up with this comprehensive map of the workflow. This ability to workflow is down to what's going on inside the data model for a workflow. When we come on to looking at some subsequent lessons, we'll explore more on how we can programmatically control what's going on in workflow state, the way in which any record intersects with workflow is through the workflow instance table. So if you see in the diagram, that left-hand side where you've got an opportunity or a case record, that opportunity or case record will have a foreign key available to it or within it called oppo_workflow ID. So this is true for any entity, including custom entities that are workflowed. That is a foreign key relationship. That's a foreign key that looks up into the workflow instance table. And the workflow instance is an intersection entity that attaches an individual record to a workflow. This means that any record inside Sage CRM, once it's in a workflow, can't belong to any other workflow. So if you've got two possible workflows inside inside CRM for opportunities, you could only, once you've chosen something, you're in that workflow. This is the idea if quite a common thing is, for example, there might be 3 separate case workflows, one for return materials authorization, one for customer complaints, and one for customer support. Customer support may well be the default workflow that everyone is using, but if you choose to go down one of the other paths, you would be locked into that path unless there is a mechanism later on that allows you to jump workflows. And that's a custom one. But basically, understand that any record that is being workflowed can only belong to one particular workflow path, and that's through the workflow instance table. The rest of the workflow is to do with modeling how that workflow allows for the record to move. So that workflow instance table will tie in the record into where it is within the workflow process. That's the state. And the state will be associated with transitions, which are the behaviors that are moving from one workflow state to another. And you will see here that this is where you have things called the workflow rules, which are the behaviors associated with the workflow. We're going to be looking at all of these now as we explore in practical terms how a workflow is built. So we can work with custom entities with workflow. You'll see that there's a number of entities, whether we've got opportunities, cases, solutions, leads, that can all have workflows associated with them. Some entities can be workflowed, but there isn't a default workflow available to them. So person, companies, communications can all have workflows associated with them, as well as a custom entity can, of course, have one available to it, but it doesn't exist out of the box. There is something called the workflow progress table, which is some behavior that is associated with 4 entities, which are the lead, cases, opportunities and solutions table, which may be workflowed and have tracking information which keeps a permanent record of how data changes. Some of these entities are governed by, or most of these entities are governed by the configuration screen, which turns on your ability to turn on workflowing for that entity. It's not the same as turning on an individual workflow, but rather the capacity for that entity to have any of the workflow features associated with them. All of these entities that I've listed out here, these business structures within inside Sage CRM, can have new workflow associated with them. As we start to talk about the different types of behavior, you'll see why certain entities don't have particular types of behavior automatically defined. So I'll explain why we don't have an out-of-the-box person, company, and communications workflow as we go through. Well, let's have a look at the idea of workflow configuration. So default workflow is provided for leads and opportunities. There are 2 opportunity workflows: cases, solutions, campaigns, waves, and wave items. If you want to, you would go into the administration screen, admin, configuration, workflow, and you can turn on the capacity to have those entities workflowed. It is something that is turned on in any way that we you want. Some of the entities have this idea of tracking, and this is because there's a progress table associated with the entity. So out of the box, leads, opportunities, solutions, and cases have the idea of workflow progress or tracking, and that appears as a tracking tab. Custom entities, which are created through the advanced customization wizard, can also have a workflow progress table created for it as well, so you can have tracking. This tab, as you can see here, is showing what data has changed and when and how long has that been in progress within the workflow. So it's using a stamp to be able to monitor the change as you're carrying out work. The work within a workflow falls into 4 types. These are all called the rules: the primary rules, the transition rules, the conditional rules, and the global rules. There is actually the 5th rule, which is the escalation rule type, which can fit into a user-driven workflow, but I need to discuss that separately in the next lesson. These rule types then, primary, transition, conditional, and global, are represented very distinctly within the context of a workflow. Now, if we were to go and build a workflow, if we were in a classroom situation, then we would certainly be going to do an exercise on this. But it takes a little while to be able to set this up, and it's much better for you to be able to see some of the demos that exist within the e-learning material on the community and within Sage Community Hub. Specifically, I think that one of the best ways of learning about the capacity of workflow within Sage CRM is to look at not only the default workflows, but some of the workflows that are available to be downloaded from community.sagecrm.com. So if you visit community.sagecrm.com, you will see a section there called downloads, and downloads within that, you'll be able to see example components and developer resources. There are existing example workflows for 2023 and 2021. So you've got an example company workflow, example case workflow, and example company workflow, which demonstrate different types of rules once they're installed. And you can download those into a test environment and be able to see how that workflow has been constructed and how it behaves. Let's have a look then at the idea of the primary rule. Any data within Sage CRM can be imagined as having a lifespan, a life cycle. Data is created, data is updated, data may be deleted, but typically data simply then exists. It becomes stable. So we have the idea of the initial creation, the update, and then the stability of that data. The idea of creation of a record is something that we can control using workflow. Entities fall into these 2 broad categories of having a sense of complexity about them, and some entities are relatively straightforward. So when we were looking at the idea of the entities in the 2nd and 3rd lessons, specifically, we discussed how entities can be constructed basically rely on a view which brings things together. And we use the company as an example of a complex entity, because if we have to think about a company inside Sage CRM, we're not just thinking about the company details. There's a default person, a default address, there is a default email, there's a default phone number, and there are intersection tables which are also completed to allow you to define different relationships between the main tables and the other table. So to what type of address is this, what type of contact is this person within the company. And so we have the idea of some entities are complex. Complex entities typically inside Sage CRM, which can be workflowed, are the company, the person, and the communication. They cannot be managed, their creation cannot be managed through workflow. So you have to have created the record before you attach it to a workflow. It's called that would be through something called a transition rule. We have an example company workflow available for you to download, again, from the community. Primary rules, though, are the mechanism by which we could create manage the creation of the entity entirely. So this is where we would look at the idea of the creation of the opportunity, the case, and the idea of the custom entity that you want. So we are able to manage the creation through a primary rule. We have within its definitions some choices about whether or not we want the rule to display. So we have the option of saying, well, only certain people can see this rule. Now, you won't see a rule unless you have a primary rule, unless you actually have a security profile that allows you to create that record. So the first thing is that you have to have a security profile within inside Sage CRM, which allows a user to be able to insert the record. If they have the rights to insert the record, that new button that you create within a workflow will appear where you would expect the new buttons to appear, within the menus of the new menus and within the listing out of that entity, like the opportunity. When we come to create this, there's some basic controls that we can put in to say, well, actually you have to be able to restrict this to a particular team to be able to use this particular process. That's relevant where you might have a larger group of people who are working with types of customer care issues, but you want a particular team to only be able to log complaints, or you may want only certain people or only an individual team to be able to handle the returns material authorization. And those types of choices to restrict can be down to simply configuration. But where workflow starts to become very sophisticated is where you can drop in, as you can see here, a JavaScript condition. So this is necessary in complex environments, where the JavaScript condition can evaluate to be true, and if it's true, the button will appear, the workflow new button will appear, and if it's false, the button will be hidden. I've got an example here of looking at, you have to be in one team or another to be able to see this button. And that's what that little example of JavaScript is doing. Here's the creation of a primary rule within inside the workflow. You define this, and I'm assuming that what you will want to do is go and have a look at some of the other existing short demo videos that are on the Sage e-learning platform and Sage support. So if you go to community.sagecrm.com, have a look at e-learning and have a look at workflow, you'll see how you can create a primary rule, how you can create a transition rule. And these are stepped examples of the process of creating one. Here we're looking at the screen, and we've got where you can put in a JavaScript condition, and that is guarding if the button is then pressed. And what the button will do in the case of a primary rule is to display a series of fields which are marked here as the workflow actions of set column value. So set column value is this a way of an action to display a field onto the screen. Now we can control, as I said, all sorts of we can control on all sorts of circumstances the ability to access a workflow button. And that's using the idea of the condition. This particular example looks at the idea of how you might have a company status that has come from the synchronization of a data from the account system. So if a company has synchronized with Sage 300, for example, and you have the flag as to indicate whether this company is on hold, you will have the ability to decide whether or not in this workflow you are wanting to allow that to happen. So we're able inside the JavaScript condition of the workflow action to use any of the behavior, any of the code context that we were using inside the table level scripts. So in this case, the valid doesn't expect you to put an error string to display out. The valid is acting as the flag to determine whether the button displays. But here you can see I'm using get context info to be able to look at the wider context. And so these workflow conditions have exactly the same question about what the scope of reference is as any other business rule within inside Sage CRM. Primary rules govern the initial creation of the record. Transition rules govern the movement from one state to another state within the workflow. That state, by the way, can, in the case of complex entities like communication, person, and company, be where the record already exists. And we have an example of this inside the default opportunity workflow, which has transition rules from the end where an entry state is to allow for a record that has been converted behind the scenes from a lead entity into an opportunity, or where something has been imported into the system and you want to then attach it into a workflow. So transition rules typically govern the movement from state to state. The same idea of a JavaScript condition applies as to whether or not the button will display. And the transition rule is linked to the entry state, which will be where a workflow an entity has been created but has not actually come into being, has not been added directly by a primary rule into a workflow. Here you can see a transition rule. This happens to be within the demo opportunity workflow for a rule called qualify. In this particular case, it's looking at a variable that has been set within inside the workflow. You can see something called oppo.com status is complete. This particular one is looking, it introduces the idea of looking at not only contextual information, but looking at the idea of how workflow actions can cross different entities. In a previous workflow rule, a communication record has been created automatically. And this is an important thing to understand about Sage CRM's workflow, is that it can work with across multiple entities. So an entity is created by a workflow action, and it can have a label associated with it that can then be checked in a subsequent workflow rule. And that's what's happening here. So a communication record was completed, was created as earlier part, and the task was to phone the customer or send a quote to the customer. And here you can see a check being oppo.com status is complete. So you're checking to see whether it's been marked as completed that particular labeled task. So you now have cross-entity workflows inside Sage CRM. Global rules are rules which allow you to introduce behavior into a workflow which will be available based on certain conditions met within the JavaScript condition of the rule, but which do not imply movement through the process. So if you wanted to reassign an opportunity to a new customer, a new user, but you didn't want to interrupt the flow of this, a global rule could be used for this. Or if you have a need to introduce a quick audit, so to run a report, to create a complete history of the communications associated with a transaction, that would be invoking, say, an ASP page or a DLL with custom behavior to assemble that information. A global rule can do that because it can be made available anywhere within the workflow. It doesn't depend on a particular state. It can look for information within the data of the rule, within the data of the workflow, to see what state thing and what values are within the fields. So you have the conditions, but it isn't linked to a particular point within the process. We have as well an example of this inside the global rule. This particular global rule you can see is displaying two fields for amendment. That's the idea of the assigned user and the channel ID or the team that the users belong to, allowing them to be reassigned at any point throughout the process. But you'll see as well that there's a check with the current user object to see whether the current user of the workflow is the currently assigned user for that opportunity. And it's only the current user could reassign it to somebody else. The last type of rule to mention are the conditional rules. Conditional rules are where you would want to take a split approach to a particular situation, depending on the state of the data in the system. So it is about moving on potentially to the next state within the workflow, but equally you could move to a different state or not move at all, depending on when the condition was met. So here, for example, this particular image is taken from the demo opportunity workflow that you can download from community.sagecrm.com. This particular example rule has a split in its behavior that you are presented, a user is presented with a button saying quote raised, but if the quote has not been raised, so the condition evaluates so that there's a failure, false, you're reverted back to the qualified stage with some messages onto the screen. But if you have done everything that you need to do, you press the button and it goes on and flows through nicely. We can see that example here. There is a check to see whether or not, and you can see this is the scope of reference being used within workflow, where we are getting the context of the current opportunity being workflowed, and then starting to look at the quotes that have been raised for this. So we have to have made sure that we have got a quote at that point. So we're checking to see, and if we don't have a quote, then it's false, and you'll see that a record, a message will be displayed on the screen. And if everything is true, everything's fine, then some fields are displayed for amendment and other tasks are done to move us on through the workflow state. Now, there are lots of different actions that can take place within a workflow. And again, if we were to cover workflow, this would be an entire day's lesson. So that's why I keep saying you're going to have to look at the demo views and some of the supporting videos on this. You'll see that we've got different types of rules and their different actions make sense in those contexts. You'll see that there are some rules that seemingly allow you within the context of a workflow to create other entities. I referenced this earlier on, and this is the idea that you can create within the context of an opportunity record a communication, or you can create a case. You can spin up something that is part of a larger process. And this is where, excuse me, this is where you've now got the ability to work with lots of different behaviors inside the system, but not all rules can do that type of behavior. So the type of rules that a primary rule cannot do is what's called a follow-up action, because a follow-up action needs you to have created that record already. It needs to have been in existence. Excuse me. Transitional rules are the ones which have the widest type of behavior, but they can't display notifications on the screen because, well, that's something that an escalation rule does. Our follow-up actions, and I apologize for the very small text on this slide. These follow-up actions then in the documentation, you'll see, allow you to carry out a whole range of different tasks to spin up other bits of behavior, including carrying out a merge to generate a document, to do what you need to, but they do rely on your record existing. That's why you can't use follow-up actions in the context of a primary rule, because the primary rule is governing the initial creation of that entity. There are occasions when you want to do something more, than those follow-up actions. You want to be able to do, say, synchronizations between systems, or you want to jump from one workflow to another workflow. And there are examples of how you can do this on Sage Community Hub. What you really want typically to be able to do is to call an ASP page or a .NET DLL to be able to do some of the tasks that interest you, that are particular for your business. An example of this can be found inside the quick opportunity workflow. That's a standard workflow within inside Sage CRM's environment. So it's one of the demo pre-built default workflows, and you can see there a rule that allows you to call an ASP page, and that explains how that's done. Another type of very large scale action that you can carry out within a workflow is to be able to run SQL statements. And these are complete statements that we're writing in here. So it's the complete DML that you're writing. You are allowed to run multiple statements, and you can reference fields that are in context. So this is the idea of using the hash merge keys. If you've looked elsewhere in the creation of templates, for example, within Sage CRM, you'll see how these are used. So this is allowing us within the context to run a statement to change a whole group of records very, very rapidly. Although you can use multiple statements within the direct execution, so you can have multiple statements within that, they can't communicate with each other. So you can only communicate with information that is in the context using this hash field. So you can't declare a variable and then use it in a subsequent SQL statement. We've covered quite a lot of ground, and I realize that you will need to go away and you will need to look at some of the other videos that explain the process of the definition of the workflow and some of the walkthroughs of the existing workflow. You will find all of those on the YouTube channel for Sage CRM, so for Sage customer support and training, and you will also find articles which discuss the definition of workflow in the context of the Sage Community Hub. We're developing this idea next week, so we're going to be looking at time-driven behavior, and I hope that that's been of use to you. Let's see if we've got any questions now. I look forward to seeing you at the next lesson. Thank you very much for coming along. See you. Bye-bye.